The icy wind of a Seattle morning bit through Jim Morgan's threadbare coat. His hands, cracked and swollen from the damp cold, clutched a battered cardboard sign. Veteran.
Hungry. Please help.
The lettering was smudged, a testament to the rain-soaked nights on the unforgiving pavement. Jim's face, worn and lined like old leather, betrayed the years of suffering and solitude that had reduced him to this state. Pedestrians moved briskly past him, their gazes fixed on phones or distant points on the horizon, avoiding his eyes. Occasionally, someone would toss a coin his way, though most passed without acknowledgement. "Hey, buddy," barked a voice. Jim looked up to see two police officers approaching. One was tall and muscular, his posture exuding authority. The other, shorter and younger, carried a clipboard and an air of indifference. "You can't just sit here," the tall officer said, his tone brusque. Jim straightened, forcing himself to be calm. "I'm not bothering anyone. Just trying to make people feel guilty," the officer interrupted. "This is loitering. You've been warned before." The younger officer hesitated, glancing at Jim's sign. "He's not hurting anyone, Mason. Maybe we can just—" "Rules are rules, Carter," Mason snapped. He gestured toward Jim. "Get up. Move along." "I don't have anywhere to go," Jim muttered, his voice low but steady. "That's not our problem." Mason leaned in, his tone sharp. "You're an eyesore. Pack it up, or we'll take you in for vagrancy." The growing crowd began to murmur. Phones emerged from pockets, recording the exchange. Jim felt his face flush with a mixture of anger and shame. "Is this really necessary?" a woman's voice broke through. An older lady with sharp eyes and a heavy wool coat stepped forward. She pointed a gloved hand at Mason. "He's not doing anything wrong." "Ma'am, stay out of this," Mason said, his tone impatient. The woman's eyes shifted to Jim. She squinted, her expression changing from irritation to astonishment. "Wait a second. I know you." Jim blinked. "You've got the wrong person, ma'am."
No.
"I've seen you before." Her voice faltered as recognition fully dawned. "You're James Morgan. Captain James Morgan. The hero from the Gulf War." A ripple went through the crowd. Conversations hushed, replaced by whispers of curiosity. Mason frowned, his aggression faltering. "What's she talking about?" The woman turned to the crowd. "He saved an entire squadron. It was on the news back then. He was a war hero. A decorated officer." Jim shifted uncomfortably, his hand tightening on the sign. The last thing he wanted was attention, especially of this kind. "That true?" Carter asked, his voice softer now. Jim sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Does it matter?" "Yes, it matters," the woman exclaimed. "How can someone like him end up here?" She gestured to his ragged appearance. "This is a disgrace." The crowd grew bolder, inching closer. Questions flew from all directions. "Why are you homeless? What happened to you? Is it true you're a hero?" Jim looked down, his face burning with humiliation. He hated their pity as much as their indifference. Mason stepped back, visibly unsettled. "We're done here," he muttered, motioning for Carter to follow. But it was too late. Someone in the crowd yelled, "This is what we do to our veterans? Shame on us." Jim felt trapped, his voice drowning in the sea of outrage and speculation. A teenager thrust a phone in his face. "Say something, man. Tell us your story." He shook his head, turning away. "I don't want to talk." But the crowd wasn't letting go. As more phones came out and voices grew louder, Jim's chest tightened. The once ignored figure on the corner had suddenly become the center of a spectacle. Through the chaos, the older woman placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Captain Morgan, let me help you. I won't let this happen to you." Her kindness cut deeper than any insult. Jim swallowed hard, his voice breaking. "You don't understand." "No one does." "Then make us understand," she urged softly. Jim's knees buckled, and he sank to the ground. He clutched the sign to his chest, his words barely a whisper. "I don't want to be a hero anymore." The crowd fell silent, the weight of his confession hanging in the cold morning air. The videos spread like wildfire. By evening, Jim's face was plastered across local news channels and social media feeds. Headlines like "Forgotten Hero," "The Tragic Fall of Captain James Morgan" sparked a frenzy of outrage and curiosity. But for Jim, the sudden attention felt less like redemption and more like a spotlight burning through what little dignity he had left. He huddled in the corner of a shelter, his meager belongings, a tattered backpack and his worn-out coat, clutched tightly. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glare over the room filled with weary, hollow-eyed occupants. "Hey, you're that guy, right?" Jim didn't look up. The voice belonged to a wiry man with greasy hair and a crooked grin. "The war hero. I saw you on my phone." Jim shifted uncomfortably, keeping his gaze fixed on the floor. "I'm just trying to get some rest." The man chuckled, sliding onto the bench beside him. "A war hero, begging for scraps like the rest of us. Ain't that something?" "Leave me alone," Jim muttered, his voice low. "Oh, I get it. Too good to talk to us regular folks, huh?" The man's tone turned mocking. Jim's fists clenched, but he said nothing. He knew better than to escalate. Across the room, a middle-aged woman with a raspy voice chimed in. "He's probably here because he blew all his money on booze and bad decisions. They always do." Laughter rippled through the shelter. Jim felt the weight of their stares, their judgments. He stood abruptly, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. The room fell quiet as he made his way to the exit, their whispers chasing him out. The night outside was colder than he expected. Jim's breath puffed out in white clouds as he wandered aimlessly through the streets. His thoughts raced, a chaotic blur of anger, shame, and the haunting echoes of gunfire from years ago. He stopped at a park bench, dropping heavily onto the frozen wood. He tilted his head back, staring at the stars barely visible through Seattle's light-polluted sky. "You okay?" A soft voice broke the silence. Jim turned to see a young woman, no older than 20, standing a few feet away. She wore a heavy scarf and held a steaming cup of coffee. "What do you want?" he asked gruffly. She hesitated, then stepped closer. "I saw you on the news." "Great," Jim muttered. He rubbed his hands together for warmth, his movements stiff and mechanical. I thought maybe you could use this." She extended the coffee toward him. Jim eyed it suspiciously. "Why?" "Because it's cold," she said simply. He took the cup reluctantly, the warmth spreading through his fingers. He sipped in silence, unsure whether to thank her or send her away. After a moment, she sat on the other end of the bench. "You're not like what they say, are you?" Jim snorted. "What do they say?" "That you're this big hero who's lost his way. That you're some tragic figure." He stared into the coffee. "People love a good tragedy. Makes them feel better about their own lives." "Maybe." She shrugged. "But some people just want to help." Jim shook his head, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Help? No one's wanted to help me for years. Not when it mattered." The young woman frowned, pulling her scarf tighter. "What happened to you?" Jim let out a hollow laugh. "You want a short version or the long one?" "Whichever one you feel like telling." He glanced at her, searching her face for signs of pity. But there was only curiosity and a hint of compassion. He sighed, leaning back against the bench. "I used to believe in things," he began, his voice low. "Honor.
Duty.
Brotherhood. I thought if you gave everything, your time, your body, your soul, the system would take care of you. But that's not how it works." She stayed quiet, letting him continue. "I came back with scars you can't see. Nightmares that don't let go. But I didn't get help. Instead, I got a system that told me to shut up and be grateful." His grip tightened on the cup. "And when you can't keep it together, when you fall apart, they toss you aside like you're nothing." Her eyes softened. "That's not right." "No, it's not," he agreed. "But it's the way it is." They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. "You should tell your story," she said finally. Jim laughed bitterly. "What? To the cameras? To people who'll forget about me the second they scroll to the next headline?" "Not for them," she said, her voice firm.
For you.
"So they don't get to decide who you are?" Her words hung in the air, piercing through the fog of his despair. Jim opened his mouth to reply, but the sound of approaching footsteps cut him off. "Hey, Jim." He turned to see a man in a crisp suit, his breath visible in the cold. His polished shoes crunched on the frost-covered grass. "I've been looking for you," the man said, extending a hand. "Peter Lansing. I'm a reporter with the Seattle Tribune." Jim stared at the outstretched hand but didn't take it. "What do you want?" "Your story," Lansing said, unfazed. "The real story. Not the 10-second sound bites or the social media buzz. People need to know what's really going on." "I'm not interested," Jim replied flatly. Lansing smiled, a practiced, professional grin. "Look, I get it. You're tired of being used. But this could be a chance to..." "To what?" Jim interrupted, his tone sharp. "To be paraded around as some sob story? To give people one more thing to argue about on the internet." The reporter hesitated, his confidence faltering. "It's more than that. You could make a difference." Jim stood, tossing the empty coffee cup into a nearby trash can. "I've had enough of making a difference. Find someone else." He walked away, leaving Lansing and the young woman behind. Their voices faded into the night, but their words lingered, gnawing at him. As he disappeared into the shadows, the city lights flickering around him, one thought clawed its way to the surface of his mind. Jim sat on the edge of his cot in the shelter, staring at the blank wall. The murmur of conversations and the occasional cough from other occupants blurred into white noise. The reporter's words lingered in his mind. "You could make a difference." He scoffed under his breath. Difference? The system he once believed in chewed people up and spit them out. Why should he care about making a difference for anyone? Yet, despite himself, the thought refused to fade. The next morning, he decided to leave the shelter early. He wandered the city aimlessly, his head down, until he found himself back at the park bench where the young woman had offered him coffee. It was empty now, the frost melted by the pale sunlight. Back to the scene of the crime? The voice startled him. He turned to see Lansing, the reporter, standing a few feet away with a smug smile. "Are you following me?" Jim asked, his tone sharp. "I prefer to call it persistence," Lansing replied, holding up his hands defensively. "I wanted to give you another chance to talk." Jim rolled his eyes. "I said no. What part of that didn't you understand?" "The part where you're the key to exposing a broken system," Lansing said, stepping closer. His tone shifted, more serious now. "Look, I know you've been betrayed before. I get it. But this isn't about you anymore. It's about everyone like you." Jim bristled. "Don't pretend you care. You're just here for a headline." "Fine," Lansing admitted, shrugging. "Yeah, I want a story. But a story like yours can actually make people listen. You're not just some random guy on the street. You're Captain James Morgan, a decorated hero. That means something." Jim turned away, his jaw tight. "Not to me," Lansing sighed. "You know, the longer you stay quiet, the more control you give to everyone else who's telling your story. You want the truth out there or not?" Jim didn't answer. Later that day, Jim found himself back at the shelter, sitting silently through lunch. Across the table sat an older man named Gerald, a fellow veteran who'd been on the streets even longer than Jim. "Why do you look like you've swallowed a grenade?" Gerald asked, his voice raspy but amused. Jim pushed his food around the plate. "Some reporter thinks my sob story will fix the world." Gerald snorted. "You let him? Hell, if some suit wants to use me to get the government to cut a check, I'd be doing cartwheels." "I don't trust him," Jim muttered. "Doesn't matter," Gerald said, leaning in. "What matters is whether you can trust yourself." The comment hit Jim harder than he expected. He stared at Gerald, searching for sarcasm in the man's weathered face, but found none. The next day, Jim walked into a dingy diner just as the lunch rush was winding down. The smell of fried food and burnt coffee clung to the air. In a corner booth sat Lansing, scribbling in a notebook. Jim hesitated for a moment before approaching. "This seat taken?" Lansing looked up, surprised but quickly masking it with a grin. "Captain Morgan. Didn't think I'd see you again." "Don't get used to it," Jim said, sliding into the booth. Lansing gestured to a waitress, ordering 2 coffees before turning back to Jim. "So, what changed your mind?" Jim folded his arms. I didn't say I'd talk. I said I'd listen. You've got one shot to convince me. Lansing leaned forward, lowering his voice. Okay, here's the deal. I've been working on a piece about how veterans get screwed by the system. You're the face I need to make it hit harder. People don't care about stats or policies, but they'll care about you. And what do I get out of it? Jim asked, his tone skeptical. Your voice back, Lansing said simply. The chance to tell the truth. To call out the people who let you fall through the cracks. Jim considered this, tapping a finger on the table. You dig into my past, you're going to find things you won't like. Such as? Jim's eyes darkened. A friend I saved, someone I trusted, stabbed me in the back. He took credit for everything I did and left me to rot. Lansing's pen hovered over his notebook. Who's the friend? Jim hesitated. Saying the name felt like reopening an old wound. But Lansing's intent gaze urged him on. Sergeant Michael Hayes, Jim finally said, his voice heavy. We were in the Gulf together. During an ambush, I got him and a bunch of others out alive. But when we got home, he twisted the story, made himself the hero. Took the medals, the promotions, everything. Lansing's pen moved furiously across the page. And you never said anything? Jim shook his head. What was the point? People like him always win. Guys like me don't stand a chance. Lansing's eyes glinted with determination. What if I told you this time they won't win? What if I told you we could take him down? Jim leaned back, his expression guarded. What's in it for you? Exposing the truth, Lansing said firmly. And yeah, maybe it's good for my career. But you deserve justice, Jim. And I think deep down you know that. 2 weeks later, the first article went live. The headline read, "The Hero Betrayed, How a Gulf War Veteran Was Erased from History." The piece detailed Jim's courage under fire, juxtaposed with Hayes's rise to prominence. Lansing included excerpts from military reports and anonymous interviews with former soldiers, corroborating Jim's account. The fallout was immediate. Hayes, now a respected military consultant, issued a statement denying the claims, calling them baseless and defamatory. But the damage was done. Jim found himself once again at the center of public attention, this time as a symbol of institutional betrayal. Support poured in from advocacy groups, fellow veterans, and ordinary citizens. Jim sat alone in the corner of a small hotel room, one paid for by a veteran support organization after the article went viral. The thin, beige curtains did little to block the city's neon glow, casting flickering shadows across the room. A television buzzed in the background, playing yet another segment dissecting the scandals surrounding Michael Hayes. Sergeant Michael Hayes denies all allegations, but has yet to provide documentation supporting his claims of heroism. Jim muted the TV, his jaw tightening. Every interview, every comment online, dragged him back into memories he wished he could erase. The next morning, a knock at the door jolted him from his restless thoughts. When he opened it, Lansing stood there, his phone in hand and a triumphant grin on his face. Guess who just agreed to an on-camera debate? Jim frowned. What are you talking about? Michael Hayes, Lansing said, stepping inside uninvited. He's going on record to defend himself. And he's agreed to do it live with you there. Jim's stomach turned. Absolutely not. Lansing blinked. What do you mean, not? This is your chance. To what? Sit in front of the world while he lies through his teeth? No thanks. Lansing sighed, pacing the room. Jim, this isn't just about you anymore. Hayes is losing credibility, but if you don't show up, he wins. People will think you were bluffing. Jim rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion creeping into every bone. I didn't ask for this. I never wanted to be dragged into some public circus. Yeah, well, sometimes the circus finds you, Lansing said bluntly. You've already come this far. Don't back out now. Jim stared at the floor for a long moment before finally nodding.
Fine.
But I'm not playing games. If he wants to talk, we'll talk about the truth. The debate was scheduled for a primetime slot on a major news network. By the time Jim arrived at the studio, the air was electric with tension. He was escorted to a green room where a nervous producer handed him a microphone. You'll be live in 10 minutes, she said, avoiding eye contact as if afraid to upset him. Jim sat stiffly in the chair, his palms sweating. Across the hall, he caught a glimpse of Hayes through a cracked door. The man looked polished and confident in his tailored suit, laughing easily with staff. The sight made Jim's stomach churn. When the broadcast began, the moderator introduced the two men, highlighting the controversy that had gripped the nation. Jim sat across from Hayes under the harsh glare of studio lights. The tension between them was palpable. "Captain Morgan," the moderator began, "your story has resonated with many, but some have questioned its validity. What would you say to those who doubt your account?" Jim leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "I'd say I never wanted to be here. I never asked for recognition. But the truth matters. What happened in the Gulf wasn't about medals or promotions. It was about survival. And I did what I had to do to protect my men." Hayes smirked, cutting in. "And yet here you are, dragging my name through the mud. For what? Attention? Sympathy?" Jim's eyes narrowed. "I didn't drag your name anywhere, Mike. You did that yourself when you took credit for something you didn't do." The audience murmured, the tension thickening. "That's a bold accusation," Hayes replied smoothly, "and one without proof. All we have is your word against mine." Jim took a deep breath. "Then let's talk about the proof. The men I saved that day, most of them are still alive. Why don't we ask them?" Hayes faltered, his polished facade cracking for a split second. "People remember things differently under stress. Memories get hazy." "Mine aren't hazy," Jim said, his voice rising. "I remember carrying you out of that ambush while bullets were flying past my head. I remember watching you take the credit while I was left to deal with the fallout alone." The moderator stepped in, trying to calm the escalating tension. "Gentlemen, let's focus on the facts. Mr. Hayes, can you address the claims that documents supporting your heroism are missing or incomplete?" Hayes hesitated, his confidence visibly waning. "Those records were lost years ago. It happens in war. But I've always served with honor." "Honor?" Jim interrupted, his voice sharp. "You don't know the meaning of the word." The debate ended in a flurry of heated exchanges, leaving the audience and viewers polarized. While some sided with Hayes, many found Jim's raw honesty compelling. Social media exploded with hashtags like #TruthForJim and #JusticeForVeterans. Backstage, Lansing caught up with Jim as he stormed out of the studio. "You did great in there." Jim spun around, his face flushed with anger. "That wasn't great. That was a mess." "Maybe," Lansing admitted, "but people heard you." Hayes looked like a liar, and you looked like someone who's been wronged. "That's what matters." Jim sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It doesn't feel like it matters." Lansing placed a hand on his shoulder. "It will. Trust me." Over the next week, the fallout from the debate intensified. Former soldiers who had served with Jim and Hayes began coming forward, corroborating Jim's account. A retired medic shared details of the ambush that matched Jim's story exactly, adding another layer of credibility. Hayes, meanwhile, doubled down on his denials, but the cracks in his story grew wider. Public pressure mounted for an official investigation into his military record. One afternoon, Jim received a phone call from an unfamiliar number. "Captain Morgan? This is Jim. This is Lieutenant Colonel Evans, retired. I served in command during the Gulf War." Jim stiffened. "What can I do for you, Colonel?" "I'm calling to apologize," Evans said, his voice heavy with regret. "I knew what Hayes did. I signed off on it because it was easier than facing the fallout. And I'm sorry for that." Jim's throat tightened. "Why now?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Evans replied. "And because you deserve better." The call ended, leaving Jim stunned. For the first time in years, the weight of betrayal began to lift, replaced by a faint glimmer of hope. That evening, as he stood at the window of his hotel room, staring out at the city lights, Jim allowed himself a moment of reflection. His fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt like he wasn't fighting alone. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming the truth, his truth, and using it to help others who had been forgotten, just like him. The days following the debate brought a whirlwind of developments. Jim's story continued to dominate headlines, and the public's outrage only grew. An official military investigation was launched into Michael Hayes' record, and within weeks, the truth became undeniable. Hayes had fabricated key parts of his narrative, relying on lost documents and institutional silence to elevate his career. The findings sent shockwaves through the veteran community. Hayes was stripped of his accolades and forced to resign from his lucrative consulting role. Public apologies poured in from military officials, advocacy groups, and even the lieutenant colonel who had once turned a blind eye. For Jim, the vindication felt surreal. Standing in front of a packed room at a veteran support center, he stared at the faces before him, men and women who, like him, had been cast aside by the system. "I'm not a hero," he began, his voice steady but raw with emotion. "I'm just someone who survived. But surviving isn't enough. We have to do better, for each other and for those who come after us." Applause filled the room, but Jim's focus wasn't on the praise. It was on the connections being forged, the determination in the eyes of those listening. With the support of Lansing and several advocacy groups, Jim founded an organization dedicated to helping veterans navigate the system and reclaim their dignity. They named it Guardians Reach, a symbol of extending a hand to those left behind. The work wasn't easy. Jim spent long days in meetings, advocating for policy changes, and long nights listening to the stories of veterans who had suffered in silence for years. Each story reminded him of his own struggles, but they also fueled his determination to fight harder. One afternoon, as Jim walked into the modest office of Guardians Reach, he found Gerald sitting at a desk, grinning. "Look at you," Gerald said, gesturing around. "Captain Morgan, running the whole damn show." Jim chuckled. "I'm just trying to keep the lights on." Gerald leaned back, his grin fading into a thoughtful expression. "You're doing more than that. You're giving people hope. Don't lose sight of that." Months turned into a year, and Guardians Reach began to make waves. They secured funding for housing programs, mental health resources, and job placement services for veterans. Media outlets continued to cover Jim's journey, but he always redirected the focus to the work being done. One day, Jim received a letter from a young soldier stationed overseas. "Captain Morgan, I saw your story online and wanted to thank you. It reminded me why I joined, to protect the people back home and to stand by my brothers and sisters in uniform. I hope that when my time here is done, I'll have someone like you watching out for me." Jim read the letter twice, his chest tightening with emotion. He folded it carefully and placed it in his desk drawer alongside a faded photo of his old squad. On the anniversary of the Gulf War's end, a ceremony was held to honor those who had served. Jim was invited to speak, but he almost didn't go. The thought of standing on a stage, being called a hero again, felt wrong. It was Gerald who convinced him. "This isn't about you," Gerald said. "It's about everyone you're fighting for. Get up there and show them what resilience looks like." So Jim stood before the crowd, the medals pinned to his chest feeling heavier than they ever had. He looked out at the audience, fellow veterans, their families, and the countless faces of those who had supported him through his journey. "Resilience isn't about never falling," he said. "It's about getting back up, no matter how many times you've been knocked down. It's about standing together and refusing to be forgotten." As the crowd rose to their feet, the applause was deafening. But for Jim, the most meaningful moment came afterward, when a young woman approached him with tears in her eyes. "My dad was a veteran," she said, her voice trembling. "He didn't make it, but I think he would have been proud of what you're doing." Jim nodded, his voice quiet but firm. "We'll make sure no one else has to go through what he did." As the sun set on Seattle that evening, Jim returned to the park where his story had taken an unexpected turn. The bench where he once sat, invisible to the world, was now a small monument, a plaque inscribed with the words, "In honor of those who serve, and those who refuse to let them be forgotten." Jim sat down, letting the cool breeze wash over him. For the first time in years, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living and fighting for a better future, not just for himself, but for all who had been left behind. And in that moment, James Morgan finally allowed himself to believe that redemption wasn't just possible, it was real.